Guys, we have a ridiculous video to get into today, because today we're going to be breaking down and dissecting Augor from MSK's Graffiti. And I'm convinced he's a genius. Like, some of the stuff he's doing here is absurd, so let's hop right into a really easy piece to dissect. And we'll get progressively more advanced really quick. So the first thing that stands out to me is the mean line on the A and the R are both really high up, and the baseline for these two letters is also pretty high up as well. Now what's going to happen when you do this is you usually shrink the top of your letters because of that. This doesn't happen for all letters, but it especially happens for the A and the R. The reason being is because for the A, this horizontal box happens at the mean line. So as a result, if you raise the mean line up, this negative space becomes smaller. And with the R, pretty much the same thing happens. As a result, this means you're going to have much larger bottoms of those letters, which creates an abundance of negative space, which he fills in with this purple right here. He even goes an extra step to include some exterior details to further fill in these larger negative space areas. Filling this sort of thing in is going to unify the negative space with the other letters, where the other letters don't really have as much negative space. Now, if we look here on the left side of the A, you can actually see this little cut in right here. That's the official terminal of the letter, the terminal being the ending of that letter. This rest of the part, yes, you could consider it the terminal, but that technically is an extension because it's not necessary for the actual structure. And he uses the extension in such a way to make it look like letter structure. That way it looks as if it's going down to every other letter's baseline, although technically it's really not, which is really smart. Now here he does something on the R that's absolutely genius, and we'll see this done again in a much more advanced context later in the video. But I wanted to point this out now, that way we can understand this concept in its simplest form. So on the R, he ends the letter right here at the higher baseline, the same thing he did with the A. From here, he uses a very obvious extension on both the left and the right side of the R in order to bring that extension down and underneath the official terminal of these areas. Now, because the extension doesn't actually extend beyond the projected letter structure, which I know this is getting like really involved, but the projected letter structure is essentially, had the letter structure continued past the point where it ended, then this area would be the letter structure. So his extensions don't pass that area too much, which makes them appear like letter structure because they're functioning within the boundaries of where the letter structure would have been. That, as a result, makes the extension still an extension, but it functions similar to how a letter structure would function, despite not being letter structure, which allows it to have a higher baseline and then have the extension fill in the rest. This is why his name has good letter name weight. This is why the letter name weight is not completely thrown out of whack, and as a result, he managed to maintain balance throughout this entire piece. And if you look real closely, he does the same thing with this extension here on the R, going from the left side of the R into the center of the R. This extension functions the same way as the previous. It functions within the projected letter structure, only exiting that projected letter structure to connect with the next letter structure. We're going to come back to this because it's going to play a massive role in one of his later pieces. Moving on to the next piece, this is pretty simple to break down. He's got a lot of negative space in these letters, and once again, what do we see him do? He fills this negative space with exterior details, extensions, things of that sort. Parts of letters that ooze and drip around in order to once again go ahead and fill these negative spaces. You can especially see this on the A, for sure, and a little bit on the R. And on the R, you'll notice he even adds a little bit of a mushroom in order to help fill in the negative space that he couldn't fill in with any extensions or anything else. But what I really wanted to talk about here is how the majority of his letters have massive amounts of letter name weight. And that's perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with that at all, but his O is really small in comparison to the rest of the letters. And to compensate for this, what does he do? He grabs an extension from the R and throws it all the way through the O up to the top. Now, if you watch my negative space management tutorial, you know about pockets and cups of negative space. He would have had one of those there on top of that O had he not filled it in. So notice how that extension is specifically created to fill in that pocket of negative space. This is not something that would work normally, but that O flows momentum directly from the A to the U to the G, all the way to the O, and then into the bottom portion of the R. So it ends up functioning perfectly fine because the structure is that way to enhance momentum flow. Now, I don't know if he intended for that to happen, but that's what's happening. And it's amazing, it's brilliant. Now, moving on to the next piece. This one's very interesting because once again, we're seeing a lot of letter distortions, we're seeing a lot of negative space again. You'll notice in areas where he has a lot of negative space, he'll usually throw his 3D or his drop shadow in that general direction in order to go ahead and try to fill some of that in. Negative space is not a bad thing to have. It allows for you to have letter structure and to define your letter structures, but if you have too much, it can definitely throw the negative space off. It can even make a letter way too little, or it can make a letter way too much, depending on the context of the negative space and where the negative space is located. Here we see he has a massive A, a medium-sized U, a pretty decent-sized G, with a pretty pretty huge O. Now, it's not necessarily a big O as far as size is concerned, but it has a lot of positive space, more so than the other letters, which is immediately going to make it a focal point. It's going to make it something that you look at for quite some time. So he's trying to balance out the O and the R with 3 other letters, meaning the O and the R have to capture a lot of space, and they have to weigh a ton in order to balance out the previous 3 letters. That's why the O has so much positive space, but the R has the exact opposite. If you notice, the R has a ton of negative space, and the reason for this is because it has to extend so far in order to help balance out the first 3 letters. It's no mistake he put all this positive space on this part of the R. That's gonna help, once again, anchor that area down, adding more weight. And notice how the 3D is really emboldened in order to help fill in a lot of that negative space that was necessary in order to eat up a lot of that room to balance out the first 3 letters. And then what does he do? One of the most prominent areas for his exterior detail, the green stuff, is right underneath the leg of the R. Why? Because there's a tremendous amount of negative space that he still needs to fill in, and that exterior detail helps him do that. Now here's the piece I wanted to talk about. This is the big one. This piece is pretty much genius. I'm giving this a stamp of approval as far as geniosity is concerned, because this is absolutely incredible. So here, once again, we're seeing what we saw in the first piece, where the mean line for the A and the R are pretty high up, meaning, once again, those negative spaces are going to be a lot more condensed. As we can see here on the A, that negative space is really tiny, and the same thing is happening on the R. And like I said before, what happens when you do that? You're going to get usually a lot of negative space on the bottoms of these letters. So that's exactly what we're seeing here. Except on the R, he brings the structure back into itself in order to fill that negative space. Now there's an interesting kind of green ooze that's happening around this piece. That green ooze is filling in a lot of this negative space, and it's giving his letters a solid object to sit on. But that ooze is actually the letter U, and that's what makes this so genius. You see, he could have just easily gone with a standard U. That would have been perfectly fine, it would have worked, he could have made that happen. But for the ooze to be this integrated into the piece, where it's literally absorbing some of the 3D, where the letters are sinking into it, where some of the ooze is going on top of the letters, and it's kind of like engulfing it, it's a really, really interactive part of the piece. And when you do this, when you're this advanced to be able to do something like this, you need to incorporate it wholly into your image. And how does he do this? What better way than to make the ooze one of the letters? And that's precisely what he does. The U becomes the ooze, giving it that much more credibility and reasonability, if that's even a word, in order to interact with the other letters. This makes a sense of cohesion with the graffiti. This is what separates the advanced graffiti artists from the pros and the masters at this art form. It's little things like this. Now in art, lines are infamous for pointing at things, and when they do, your eye goes there. So he has this extension pointing directly at the negative space of the U that creates the 3D that defines the structure. That negative space literally defines the U's structure, and the G points at it. That extension from the G also swings right underneath the A in order to help carry the A's weight. Although it's not really necessary, it is a nice touch, and it only benefits the letters. Now the O is cradled against the back of the G, and this of course goes into line uniformity and similarity, which we talk about very often in this series, so those two are going to work pretty flawlessly together. But then he does the same thing with the R, where he cradles the R right into the O, and even he's got a part of the R that looks as if it's coming out of the O's mouth. Now you can make your own assumptions as to what that looks like, as if like the thing is about to bite it, or if it's vomiting, you know, the R out. Regardless of what your perception is of it, it's nice placement, it's nice composition. So that part of the R technically is also an extension. But if you notice, this part of the R reflects the actual true terminal of the letter's structure. You see, the back of the R's true terminal is right here. This is where the R's structure technically ends, but he throws the extension from the bottom right of the left side and swings it directly underneath, keeping that line uniformity with the true terminal on this extension, and then adds a little bit of a serif. So really, this extension could totally be perceived as structure, and that's perfectly fine. Because just like the first piece we looked at, it's still functioning within the projected structure of the letter, and that gives it the functionality of letter structure despite being an extension. He then goes ahead and adds the bowl of the R once again, really, really tiny because the mean line is pretty high, and he swings a skinny leg of the R to the right and then back in on itself. From here, he goes into the bottom portion of the R and throws an extension on top in order to once again add weight and add letter uniformity and similarity. If you notice, the A has something very similar on it. All of this to once again help the piece flow as a whole. At the end of the day, when you're doing graffiti of any kind, whether it's basic or advanced, you're looking for a sense of uniformity, a sense of cohesion. Remember, our individual letters are meant to work in a cohesive manner, that way they can make one individual word. That's why flow is so important in graffiti. Now in basic straight letters and basic print font hand styles, flow happens automatically without you having to do anything to it, but in more stylized work, you have to work really hard for flow. And he's got this down pat. Like, he's got this down to a science. If you guys want to take it upon yourselves, look at his interior details. His interior details are really optimized in order to enhance letter uniformity and similarity, all even while suggesting forms. If you haven't seen my tutorial on flow, I highly suggest you watch it. We go through all the ins and outs on it and teach you everything you need to know about that topic. But there's a lot more to this piece that meets the eye that we don't have time to get into today's video. So ladies and gentlemen, in the comments down below, let me know what graffiti artists you'd like me to dissect next. Anyway, I absolutely love his work. If you guys enjoyed today's video, let me know in the comments down below, and feel free to hit the like button as it helps out a bunch. If we can get this video to like 300 likes, I'll come out with another video, then I'll come out with another episode for this series. Anyway, for those of you guys who are new here, we come out with 2 graffiti videos a week, so feel free to subscribe. We got a lot of great content. I'll catch you guys next time. Till then, peace.